Say, Cape Monster, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You know Trekkie Monster who lives upstairs?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Well, he's Trekkie Monster, and you're Cape Monster.
Right.
You're both monsters.
Yeah.
Are you two related?
What? Princeton? I'm surprised at you. I find that racist.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I was just asking.
Well, it's a touchy subject. No, not all monsters are related. So what are you think? What are you trying to say, huh? That we all look alike?
No. That's not at all what I was saying. I'm sorry. I guess that was a little racist.
I should say so. You should be much more careful when you're talking about sensitive issues such as race.
Well, look who's talking.
Well, what do you mean?
What about that special monster school you told me about?
What about it?
Could someone like me go into that school?
No, we don't want people like you.
You see, you're a little bit racist.
I guess we're both a little bit racist.
And admitting it is not an easy thing to do. So I just wanted to share this little scene that was from one of my favorite musicals. I have to confess, it's called Avenue Q. And in it, there's a song that's called Everyone's a Little Bit Racist Sometimes. And it's about, and that scene came to mind, especially when Venerable Chuni was talking about the challenge of looking at our own racist conditioning. And it struck me too when Toji was sharing how often minorities have prejudice against each other. So racism comes in many, many forms. So I thought today to invite my fellow nun and minority to just chit-chat a bit about our experience of race in America. So, Venerable Nima, I understand you came from Colombia when you were 17, and that's where you grew up. So what has your experience of race in America been like?
For a while, I wasn't able to relate to it because when I came to this country, I was already in my late teens. So I had been really insulated growing up in a country where I looked like everybody else. And so I didn't have the psychological issues that kind of are prevalent in people who experience racism from early on. And so I think that gave me a little bit of an insulation, a little bit of an advantage in that I didn't have that.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this, I really resonated with your experience too, because I also grew up in Singapore as the majority. You know, everyone looked like me, Chinese. You turn on the TV, you watch a Chinese show. I think the first time I became aware of what it was like to be a minority was coming here and studying at college in America. And I would say that is an experience that can only be lived. And it was very helpful for me to go back with that kind of awareness of that if you are in the majority, you just don't pick up because everybody looks like you. Everyone seems to have the same shared normal experience. So for the first time when I was at college, I looked different. My reality was not shared with everybody else. And that gave me something to really think about, what it is like to be a minority. And what was very helpful was when I went back to become a public school teacher, I could bring that lens into the classroom that I would never have had if I hadn't lived overseas. Like for the first time, I was looking out for racial dynamics between students. I could watch out for students who might be the only minority in the classroom. I made sure that the minority girls had a safe space to speak because I knew how challenging that was. If you're the one minority woman in the classroom, it can be very intimidating to speak up. And yeah, so I was actually very grateful for that experience.
Yes, for a long time, as I was relating to other minorities here in the States, and particularly with African American minorities and friends and so forth, they would mention this idea of white privilege, and I had really no clue what that was all about. Didn't understand the significance of it or even what it meant. But it's been most recently since the Trump administration, the presidential campaign, and now the actual administration that I've beginning to see myself as a target of people's animosity and hate, and that has helped me understand a lot more about what white privilege means, in that you don't have to um, see yourself as a target solely based on the color of your skin. And I think that relates back to my experience growing up in Colombia, because as I looked like everybody else, I didn't stand out. I was not a target because of my skin color, although, you could always be mugged there like anybody else, but it was not as a result of what I look like. And other factors apply. But here, and especially now, uh, beginning to see that people could hate me and could hate people that look like me simply on the basis of the color of the skin, which is something that we cannot do anything about. It's not like you can take it off and look differently. So it's definitely a very different feeling.
Yeah, and what you're saying, one thing I really was curious about when I was at college too, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. I also had a lot of African American friends, and they had a kind of hyper vigilance. Sometimes I don't know what the word is that I could not understand, but that comes from growing up as a minority, I think. Like there were certain things that they knew, like no cab's gonna stop for you at night if you're black. Like things that I never had to think about ever. Or a friend of mine who said he would never sit with his back to the restaurant door because you don't know who, you need to know who's gonna come in and if you're gonna get jumped. I was like, wow. Um, yeah, or we would be watching TV and then I always remember how we were watching TV and an ad for De Beers, the diamond company, came on the screen. And suddenly the whole room of both Africans and African Americans erupted like, De Beers, they are destroying Africa, and got into this huge political discussion about the diamond industry. And it was so charged, like, so it was helpful too to see the world from a different perspective. But there were times I wondered if they're only viewing things through a racial lens. I don't know. I wasn't always comfortable with the anger and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I don't know what you think.
What I have experienced, particularly in the past few years, is that having to be looking over your shoulder, and having the experience of being treated differently and being looked at differently kind of begins to erode your self confidence. And I think it begins to, yeah, your self esteem begins to suffer as a result of that, and not being even feeling comfortable in your own skin, which is very likely, as we see, uh, able to lead to anger, to frustration, and to um, yeah, a lot of feelings of being displaced, even within your own country, within your own society. And so it's, I think we're seeing that in the amount of anger that is also being expressed by minorities in this country. So I just being treated like that all the time in different venues, in education, economically, it's just very, very prevalent.
And at the same time, one thing I struggled a lot with when I understood my own position as a majority back in Singapore was a lot of guilt, which I also didn't. I mean, just looking at the dynamic and being aware, like, am I part of some kind of system that's oppressing minority people? And what really stood out for me was when I was working on the portfolio about just looking at the whole system of domestic workers who come into Singapore from Indonesia. I remember I went on a study trip with work, and then we went to visit these big training centers for domestic workers, and they're kind of kept in there for months at a time because they have a whole, it's like indentured labor basically. They're kept in these camps to train before they get sent out to different parts of Asia. And what shocked me was that all these places were run by Chinese across Malaysia and Indonesia for whatever reason. And I was like, it made me see why the Chinese are disliked in Southeast Asia and many parts of Southeast Asia. And suddenly I felt very ashamed to be ethnically Chinese, which was not useful or, suddenly I owned this part of racial identity and it was very confusing. I don't know.
Um, I think most of the problem with racism really lies in terms of the racist systems and the racist structures that perpetuate, I think, the underprivileged condition of those who are different. Because even in this country, coming in as an immigrant, one of the things that I always say when this topic comes up is that I have experienced a lot more kindness than I have experienced racism or discrimination, even though it has been there. So there is definitely a lot of people everywhere in this country who do not feel like that, do not treat minorities in that way. But there is also, however, but there is the structure, the systems that do perpetuate uh, the racism at a societal level. And so I think that what we're seeing right now with this big I would say, not necessarily uprising, but this big resurgence of the voices of moderation, understanding, and cooperation between races. That the important thing is to establish connections between people, human to human, so that we can see beyond the color of our skin and relate to each other from the humanness that unites us rather than the small details that seem different, that seem to make us different. So, learning about each other's culture, learning about each other's way of life, each other's languages, sort of try to build those bridges person to person to person, I think would go a long way towards creating a more inclusive atmosphere, environment, society.
Yeah, I would agree. I think sometimes I think friendship is almost radical because you don't you when you get to know someone as a friend, you see their complexity. They're not just one thing or one label. When our Venerable often gets us to reflect on what are the common things between our friends, right? How we make friends as often as part of our monastic life training. And one thing that surprised me looking back was that I had three very good friends from college who were all gay black men. Kind of, it just happened that way. But I did not see them as gay men or black men. Like the friendship was built on a lot of other things, like interest in the arts or ideas or philosophy, religion. Yeah, talking about seeing them as a race person or a particular identity was not so much part of our relationship at all. So I don't know if that's a kind of naivete or blindness, but we were connecting about other things.
I think that's a good way to approach it, to reach out to someone who looks different and really treat them as individuals rather than as part of a group. One of the things that I wanted, one example that I wanted to bring up, and I don't want Ryan to feel um, to feel like you've been picked on, but um, I've I've had for some time a bias to or against um, white men with a lot of tattoos, because they seem threatening to me. The skinheads usually wear a lot of tattoos and they're big and tall, like our friend Ryan here. And it's been through building this communication, this familiarity, that I can say to myself, you know what? Not all white men who are tall and big and have tattoos are necessarily going to hurt me. So thank you, Ryan, for that. So I think it's through that we begin to break those stereotypes that not just generate animosity between people, but keep us isolated from the experience of knowing someone who is different and learning from them. So it also hurts us in a way because it limits our ability to experience the range of humanity, in a positive way.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is work we just have to keep doing day to day, regardless of whether there's some kind of overt, open conflict happening. That's how I felt. Definitely going back to Singapore, just how we interact with people who are different and how we work with our own minds in relation to that difference, whatever fear or whatever comes up, is a daily process, and we have to do it constantly. Like waiting till there's some kind of blow up to work on it, it's a bit late.
Yeah, it's being aware of what is happening in our mind and how we are, the messages that we're telling ourselves about the people around us, and having the curiosity to explore our own beliefs and our own attitudes, and not just exploring them, but also having the courage to overcome them by doing or reaching out to others. So.
I think as long as we keep saying different, as long as we keep thinking different, we're going to treat them different. We have to say, you're the same as me.
Along that line of, as long as we keep looking for difference, we see it. And when we look for sameness, we see it. I remember many years ago, I was leading a retreat at Cloud Mountain, and one African-American woman who had been coming regularly to DFF came to the retreat. It was a lovely retreat. And afterwards, she said to me, that was the first retreat where I felt invisible to myself, because most of the people at the retreat were white. Not everybody, but most people were. But I thought her remark was very insightful, that it's not just how we see others, it's how we see ourselves. And if we see ourselves as different, then we see bias towards whatever group we have. Yeah. When we see the sameness of ourselves and others, we don't pinpoint those things. They don't stick out to us so much. They have a little slogan, pickpockets see pockets. Yeah? And so when we set up, this all has to do with setting up identities and clinging to identities. So I'm not saying identities are bad. On a conventional level, there are identities. But when we cling to them and think we are them, then we see the world through identities. And then no matter where we go or who we're with, we are different. Because if we're in one group, we may be racially different. When we're with people of our own race, well, then, I'm a woman and I don't fit in with the people who are men. Or whatever group you're in, there's always a way we can find ourselves to be different. And then we notice differences and we become more sensitive to them. Yeah? So I'm not saying these things don't agree, but I'm saying that the degree to which they appear to our mind depends on what we pay attention to. Yeah? Because I know when I go to India, I can spend a lot of time feeling different. Yeah? Or I can spend a lot of time feeling the same. And it's up to me too. Not just how I see the others, but how I see myself.
Thank you very much for sharing, Venerables. All of this, beautifully said. Actually, where I grew up in Los Angeles, white people were the minority. At my school, there was about 2 white people in the entire school. And they were like a brother and sister or something. And they stood out because we had no white people, almost at all. Even in my city growing up, I almost never saw white people. And I didn't start seeing white people until like adulthood. Until I, because all through my school years, basically no white people. And so they were the minority. And what I learned, having experienced racism from other minority groups too, or prejudice, often very violent, what I learned is oftentimes the group, other minority that would be like, they would attack people that look different from other minorities, throw rocks, even have guns pointed. They would come in gangs and attack you while you're walking to school, things like that. Very brutal and violent, but what I learned is the same group that would be doing this, or people from this group, would say they're being oppressed the most, or being treated racist by the system. But this would be like somebody whose family was murdered, and then they go around start murdering other people and justifying it, saying because their family was murdered, it's okay for them to murder people who have other families. So what I learned, because I learned not to be a victim of that, because it's always in the mind too. And a lot of the whites and blacks here in the US, actually, they predominantly speak English. So they belong to the same linguistic Anglophone culture, actually. Whereas a European who speaks French or German, or an African from like Ethiopia or Somalia, they have their own culture and language. It's very different. So a lot of the skin color dynamic here is limited to the Anglophone culture, because in Africa and Europe and Asia, there's many different nations and tribes with their own languages, and they don't have this mentality. If you ask like a European or African or Asian if they're white, black, or yellow, they won't identify it by their skin color first. They would identify by their language, their nation, or even their tribe. Whereas in the US is like one of the few countries where people identify their race as a skin color, but skin color is technically not a culture, you know. So that's what I saw too. And one more important thing which I learned is not just one group suffers because of their color or race. Everybody is suffering. Not just black people, but white people, Jewish people, Asian people, Latino people, Native people. All humans are suffering. And only Dharma can provide a way to end that suffering. That is all.